The dawn of October 25, 1944, broke quietly over the waters east of the Philippines. For the men of Task Unit 77.43, better known as Taffy 3, it was just another morning at sea. The sun rose, waves lapped at hulls, seagulls cried in the distance. Routine choreographed every movement aboard the escort carriers and their screens of destroyers and destroyer escorts. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. These ships were not built for fleet action. They were modest vessels, carriers designed to protect convoys, to hunt submarines, to support amphibious landings. Their aircraft were light, their guns were few. Their crews carried on with tasks learned and practiced day after day. Officers reviewed flight schedules. Pilots prepared their aircraft for patrol. Sailors in the engine rooms checked gauges and valves with quiet diligence. On the bridge of the USS Gambier Bay, sailors sipped coffee and discussed the weather reports. There was nothing outwardly unusual about the morning. Yet, the world was changing. Far beyond the horizon, a massive naval force was moving through the dark waters of the Sibuyan Sea, a force that would soon appear on the radar screens of ships who were meant only to protect and escort. The men of Taffy 3 did not know it yet. No alarm sounded this early. No urgent signals flashed across command nets. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, a backdrop to a larger operation already underway, the invasion of Leyte. But in war, routine is fragile. As the sun climbed higher, the first hints of something extraordinary began to stir. Faint radio messages, distant silhouettes on the horizon, and an instinctive unease only seasoned sailors could sense. They could not yet know that within minutes, the calm of that October morning would dissolve into chaos. The day would mark one of the most improbable confrontations in naval history. And for these 7 tiny ships, it would become a moment that defined everything they stood for. Taffy 3 was not a battle group. It was a collection of ships designed for a very different kind of war, a war against submarines, not battleships. Against threats that hid beneath the surface, not steel giants that dominated the horizon. At the center of the formation were 6 escort carriers. Smaller and slower than fleet carriers, they carried fewer aircraft and had little armor. Their primary role was air support for troops on shore and protection for convoys. They were never meant to stand in the path of an enemy surface fleet. Surrounding them were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Even these names can be misleading. The destroyers were fast and aggressive ships, but lightly armored. Their guns were small compared to those mounted on heavy cruisers or battleships. Their greatest weapon was the torpedo, a tool designed for ambush, not prolonged engagement. The destroyer escorts were smaller still, built for endurance rather than speed. Their purpose was to patrol, to detect submarines, and to protect larger vessels from unseen threats below the waves. In a fleet action, they were never meant to lead an attack. Against aircraft, these ships could defend themselves. Against submarines, they were effective. Against battleships, they were nearly helpless. To understand the imbalance, one must understand scale. A single Japanese battleship carried guns larger than anything Taffy 3 possessed combined. Shells weighing over a ton could be fired across distances measured in miles. Their armor was thick enough to shrug off hits that would destroy smaller ships outright. If doctrine had been followed, ships like those in Taffy 3 would never even be present when such an enemy appeared. They were positioned here precisely because command believed the area was safe. The main Japanese fleet had already been engaged elsewhere, or so it was believed. Carrier airstrikes had damaged and scattered enemy formations. The threat, according to planners, had passed, and so these ships remained, exposed and unaware, carrying out missions they had been trained for, guarding a sector no one expected to be contested. What followed would not be a test of firepower. It would be a test of decision-making under impossible conditions, because when these ships finally understood what was coming toward them, They would face a truth no naval manual had prepared them for. They were about to fight an enemy they were never meant to face, not because they had been ordered to, but because there was no one else left to stop it. The force approaching Taffy 3 was not a raiding group. It was not a scouting element. It was not a desperate remnant of a defeated navy. It was the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still assemble. Commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the Japanese center force represented the last attempt to use overwhelming naval firepower to alter the course of the war in the Pacific. At its core were battleships, not just any battleships, but some of the most heavily armed warships ever built. Among them was Yamato, the largest battleship in history. Her main guns were so massive that each shell weighed more than a small automobile. Alongside her sailed Nagato, Haruna, and Kongu, veterans of earlier campaigns, still lethal despite years of attrition. Supporting them were heavy cruisers, fast and aggressive ships, armed with powerful guns and long-range torpedoes. These cruisers were designed to shred lighter vessels in minutes. They had trained for night actions, surprise engagements, and coordinated fleet maneuvers. In total, Kurita's force consisted of dozens of warships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, moving together with a single purpose: to break through. The plan was brutally simple. Japan no longer possessed the carrier strength to challenge American air power directly, but battleships still carried an advantage no aircraft could fully negate: endurance. If they could reach the vulnerable invasion forces at Leyte, they could devastate transport ships, supply lines, and landing beaches. Taffy 3 stood directly in that path. Yet Kurita did not expect resistance from this direction. American fleet carriers were believed to be elsewhere. Escort carriers were dismissed as insignificant. The idea that such ships might challenge his force did not fit any known doctrine. As Kurita's ships moved through the early morning mist, their guns were already trained outward, crews alert but confident. They had survived air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea. They had pushed through losses and confusion. Now, the path ahead seemed open. From the bridges of these Japanese warships, the ocean appeared empty, calm, almost welcoming. But this confidence carried its own danger. Because overwhelming strength can create blind spots. Kurita's fleet was powerful, but it was also stretched, fatigued, and operating under incomplete information. Communication was strained, reports conflicted. Shadows on the horizon could be misread. And when the first American ships finally appeared in view, they did not resemble the fleet Kurita expected to encounter. What he saw instead would challenge assumptions, and begin a chain of misjudgments that would shape the rest of the battle. The Battle of Samar did not begin with gunfire. It began with assumptions. In October 1944, the American invasion of Leyte was the largest amphibious operation it had conducted in the Pacific. To protect it, the U.S. Navy deployed immense forces, fast carrier groups, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, spread across a wide area. Japanese planners responded with a desperate, but complex plan, Operation Shoji. The idea was to lure the American fast carriers away from the landing area, opening a path for surface forces to strike the invasion fleet directly. Decoys would draw attention. Multiple naval formations would converge from different directions. On paper, it was audacious. In execution, it relied on perfect timing and perfect interpretation of incomplete information. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, believed he had achieved his objective. Japanese carrier forces had been sighted to the north. They appeared vulnerable, and most importantly, they appeared to be the main threat. So Halsey pursued them. What he did not leave behind was a dedicated surface force to guard the San Bernardino Strait, the route Kurita's powerful center force would soon use. This decision created a gap no one believes the Japanese could exploit. The responsibility for guarding the eastern approaches to Leyte fell to 7th Fleet units, including the escort carriers of Taffy 3. They were never informed that a major Japanese surface force might break through. Their orders remained unchanged: provide air support, conduct patrols, defend against submarines. In the chaos of overlapping commands and rapidly changing reports, no one connected the dots in time. Kurita's fleet passed through the strait largely unopposed, and as dawn broke on October 25th, to forces that were never meant to meet found themselves on a collision course. This was not a failure of courage. It was not a failure of preparation at the tactical level. It was a failure of perspective. Each commander acted on what seemed logical in the moment. Each believed the greater threat lay elsewhere. By the time the mistake became visible on radar screens off Samar, there was no time left to correct it, only time to react. Shortly after sunrise, the first signs appeared. At first, they were uncertain, faint radar contacts at extreme range, shapes that did not match expectations, reports that seemed too large, too fast, too organized to be real. On the bridges of Taffy 3's ships, officers studied their screens in silence. These were not aircraft. These were not submarines. As the contacts drew closer, visual confirmation followed: dark shapes on the horizon, tall masts, superstructures that did not belong to escort carriers or destroyers, battleships. The realization spread quickly, and with it, disbelief. This was not supposed to be happening here. Range estimates came in, gun flashes were spotted. Water plumes rose in the distance as shells began to fall short, enormous columns of spray that dwarfed anything the American sailors had ever seen. These were not warning shots, they were ranging salvos. Within minutes, the truth became unavoidable. A full Japanese surface fleet was bearing down on Taffy 3. The radio crackled with urgent messages. Bearings were called out, speed was increased. Smoke generators were activated, but there was nowhere to run. The escort carriers could barely reach top speed even under ideal conditions. Their decks were crowded with aircraft preparing to launch. Their thin hulls offered no protection against heavy shells. On the bridges, decisions had to be made instantly. Should they turn away and scatter? Should they launch aircraft immediately, regardless of readiness? Should they signal for a help that might never arrive? Amid the confusion, one fact dominated every calculation. They were outmatched, not slightly, not temporarily, completely. Yet despite the shock, panic did not take hold. Orders were issued calmly, procedures were followed, and within moments, the American ships began to do the only thing left to them. They turned toward the enemy, not because they believed they could win, but because retreat alone would guarantee destruction. When the scale of the threat became clear, there was no time for debate. On the American side, command structures were simple, not because of design, but because of necessity. There were no reserves, no heavier ships hidden over the horizon, no second line of defense waiting to intervene. There was only Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding the unit from aboard the escort carrier, USS Fanshawe Bay. Understood the situation immediately. His ships were slower, his aircraft were lightly armed, his escorts were hopelessly outgunned. But what he also understood was this: if the Japanese fleet broke through, the invasion forces at Leyte would be exposed. Transports, troop ships, supply vessels, thousands of men on open beaches. There would be no stopping it. So Sprague issued an order that should have been meaningless. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were to attack. They were to lay smoke, charge the enemy, and launch torpedoes, not to destroy the fleet, but to delay it, to disrupt, to confuse, to buy time measured not in victory, but in minutes. The message was brief, almost understated. Small boys, attack. Those words were not dramatic when spoken. They were practical, direct, and quietly devastating in their implication. Every officer receiving that order knew exactly what it meant. This was not a maneuver. This was not a calculated risk. This was a one-way mission. The destroyers turned toward the Japanese line. Engines pushed beyond rated limits. Smoke generators poured thick clouds across the water, obscuring the carriers behind them. On board, sailors prepared torpedoes in conditions never intended for their use. Fire control solutions were improvised. There would be no perfect angles, no coordinated fleet movements, just speed, courage, and timing. No one believed these attacks would sink battleships. But they might force them to turn, they might break formation. They might create the illusion of a larger force. And in naval warfare, perception can be as powerful as firepower. As the destroyers surged forward, they carried with them the unspoken understanding that survival was secondary. Their task was not to win. It was to stand in the way. The destroyers did not hesitate. They accelerated directly into gunfire that could tear them apart with a single hit. From the bridges of ships like USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann, the enemy line was clearly visible. Towering silhouettes, flashes of enormous guns, columns of water rising like buildings, where shells struck the sea. This was not a skirmish, this was a charge. As Johnston increased speed, her captain, Ernest E. Evans, stood openly on the bridge, fully exposed. He had ordered full power. There would be no attempt to withdraw once contact was made. The first Japanese salvos bracketed the destroyers almost immediately. Near misses shook hulls violently. Shrapnel rained across decks. Every impact threatened catastrophic damage. Still, they closed the distance. Smoke screens thickened the battlefield, breaking sightlines and forcing the Japanese gunners to constantly reacquire targets. Through gaps in the smoke, the destroyers launched torpedoes, long, slender weapons racing toward ships hundreds of times their size. Some torpedoes missed, some ran out of fuel, but some struck. Explosions tore into Japanese cruisers, forcing sudden course changes. Ships turned away to avoid further hits. Formations fractured. The effect was immediate. What had been a coherent battle line became a scattered advance, each ship maneuvering independently under the belief that it was under attack by a much larger force. The Japanese commanders could not see clearly. Smoke, splashes, and overlapping reports created confusion. The destroyers seemed to appear everywhere at once. Meanwhile, the American ships paid a brutal price. Johnston was hit repeatedly. Shells punched through her thin armor, destroying gun mounts and killing crewmen at their stations. Fires burned unchecked. Communications failed. Hull pressed her attack even though her engines were damaged and flooding worsened. She launched torpedoes at close range, drawing intense fire. Heermann maneuvered aggressively, firing at cruisers and battleships alike, forcing them to turn and re-engage. These ships were never meant to survive this kind of engagement, but survival was not the objective. Each minute the destroyers remained in front of the Japanese guns was a minute the escort carriers behind them could launch aircraft. A minute the invasion fleet remained untouched. The disparity in firepower did not disappear, but it was no longer decisive. Because now, the Japanese fleet was reacting, not advancing. Make sure you're subscribed, you don't want to miss what happens next. While the destroyers fought at the surface, the escort carriers were doing the only thing they could. They launched aircraft. There was no time to fully rearm. Some planes carried only partial loads. Others had no bombs at all. Fuel levels were low. Ammunition was scarce. None of that mattered. Pilots took off knowing they could not inflict decisive damage. Their mission was not destruction. It was disruption. American aircraft rushed toward the Japanese fleet in small, uncoordinated groups. They dove through flak bursts and fighter opposition, attacking from multiple directions, forcing the enemy to constantly react. When bombs were available, they were dropped on cruisers and destroyers. When they were not, pilots strafed with machine guns. And when even that was impossible, they made attack runs anyway. They dove straight at battleships. From the Japanese perspective, this mattered. Each diving aircraft demanded attention. Each attack run forced evasive maneuvers. Each moment spent maneuvering was a moment not spent advancing. The attacks created the illusion of overwhelming air power. Japanese gunners could not easily tell which planes carried bombs and which did not. Smoke, explosions, and near misses blurred distinctions. Some pilots reported diving on ships with empty weapon racks, pulling out at the last second, trusting that the enemy would not know the difference. It was a dangerous deception. Aircraft were shot down, pilots were lost. Others returned with damaged planes barely capable of landing, but the effect accumulated. The Japanese fleet began to behave as if it were under sustained carrier attack, because in practice, it was. Meanwhile, the escort carriers turned away, retreating eastward at full speed. Planes landed, refueled, and took off again in a continuous cycle. No single attack was decisive, but together, they created pressure. Pressure that compounded confusion, pressure that bought time. And time, in this battle, was the most valuable resource of all. From the bridges of Kurita's flagship, the morning appeared under control. The Japanese center force was enormous, well-armed, and confident. Battleships thundered down the water, cruisers moved with precision, and destroyers screened the formation. From a distance, it seemed unstoppable. But appearances can deceive. Reports were conflicting. Forward ships signaled enemy encounters that did not match the expected American formations. Radar and visual sightings created overlapping information, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes delayed. Kurita's officers struggled to make sense of it. Orders were issued, sometimes contradictory. One ship reported torpedo attacks. Another reported aircraft dive bombing from unexpected directions. Smoke screens obscured visibility. Shell splashes from the American destroyers created the illusion of additional ships. Every decision carried weight. Every hesitation could prove fatal. Kurita's fleet had not trained for this scenario, not for small, fast ships charging directly, nor for aircraft flying light or empty-handed. The tactics were unorthodox, almost chaotic, yet terrifyingly effective. Communication lines were stretched to the breaking point. Signals had to pass through multiple relay ships. By the time an order reached a forward cruiser, circumstances had already changed. Some captains interpreted the attacks as coming from a larger force. Some assumed additional American carriers were nearby. Others hesitated, unsure whether advancing might expose their ships to unseen dangers. This hesitation mattered, because in naval combat, uncertainty is often as lethal as enemy fire. Kurita was faced with a choice he did not want to make: push forward, or withdraw to preserve his fleet. Each option carried risk. Each decision might expose him to what he could not yet see. The combination of smoke, splashes, and small but relentless attacks forced him to pause repeatedly. Targets appeared, disappeared, and shifted. Speed was reduced, formation lines became disordered. Opportunities to press the attack slipped by. For the first time in the operation, overwhelming firepower alone was not dictating the battle. Instead, confusion, compounded by courage, audacity, and improvisation, shaped the outcome. By the time the fleet adjusted, WW3 small ships had already set the terms of engagement, forcing the Japanese commanders to respond to events rather than dictate them. The illusion of a larger American presence had taken hold, and for a moment, the seemingly invincible center force was reacting instead of acting. Among the destroyers and escorts, 3 ships stood out, not because they were large, or because they had overwhelming firepower, but because of the decisions made on their bridges. The USS Johnston, under the command of Captain Ernest E. Evans, was one of the first to engage. She was fast, lightly armored, and armed with torpedoes and medium-caliber guns, a mere fraction of the firepower facing her. Evans understood the stakes, but he had no illusions. Survival was unlikely, yet he attacked. Johnston weaved through gunfire, closing distances that any naval manual would have labeled suicidal. Torpedoes were launched at Japanese cruisers. The ship maneuvered aggressively, drawing fire and confusing the enemy. Each hit she absorbed inflicted casualties and damage, yet she remained in the fight. Nearby, USS Hull, commanded by Captain Clarence C. Matheson, executed a similar, almost ritualistic charge. Her mission was clear: attack, disrupt, delay. She pressed forward even as her engines were hit and flooding began. Torpedoes found their marks. Her gunners fired at enemies that were many times larger, forcing course changes and forcing the Japanese to split attention. Hull's crew knew they were facing overwhelming odds, yet no hesitation marked their actions. Then there was USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort under Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland. She was smaller, slower, and lightly armed, but she was aggressive. Copeland positioned her directly against a Japanese heavy cruiser, launching torpedoes and engaging in gunfire that seemed impossible. The ship was hit multiple times, flooding quickly, yet she continued to maneuver, to fight, to protect the carriers behind her. These three ships shared a fate common to all the destroyers and escorts that day. Each act of courage carried a heavy cost. Shells ripped through decks, fires burned uncontrolled, machinery failed, and men were killed or wounded. And yet, their impact was far greater than their size suggested. Every minute these ships remained in the fight bought time for the escort carriers to launch aircraft. Every evasive maneuver, every torpedo launched, every smoke screen laid contributed to the illusion of a larger force. Every sacrifice disrupted the Japanese advance, forcing them to react rather than proceed. By mid-morning, both Johnston and Hull had been lost. Samuel B. Roberts was critically damaged, but her crew continued to resist until she, too, succumbed. Their actions were a testament not to luck or firepower, but to audacity and disciplined courage. In the larger story of the battle, these losses might seem catastrophic. Yet, paradoxically, they were the foundation of the American defense. By challenging the Japanese fleet directly, by forcing confusion and disruption, these ships transformed what should have been a massacre into a standoff. The center force could not ignore them. It could not bypass them. The lesson was stark and clear. In warfare, size and firepower are not always decisive. Human decision-making, boldness, and determination can tilt the scales, even against overwhelming odds. And for those 7 tiny ships of Taffy 3, this principle would define the rest of the battle. 4 hours, the battle raged, shells fell, torpedoes streaked through the water, aircraft dove from the skies, and smoke obscured nearly everything. The 7 tiny ships of Taffy 3 had bought precious time, disrupted the Japanese formations, and inflicted damage that was impossible to ignore. Yet the center force was enormous. They could have pressed forward. They outgunned, outmassed, and outnumbered the Americans at every point. But then something shifted. Reports reached Vice Admiral Kurita that his fleet had suffered more damage than expected. Ships were maneuvering unpredictably. The small American vessels, though lightly armed, seemed everywhere at once. Torpedoes continued to strike, and smoke screens concealed the carriers behind them. The psychological effect was enormous. Kurita hesitated. He weighed the risks. His commanders gave conflicting advice. Each second spent deliberating slowed their advance. In the mind of the Japanese fleet, perception began to dominate reality. The belief that they might be facing a larger force grew. The attacks from the tiny carriers and the destroyers had created the impression of overwhelming resistance. The fear of additional airstrikes from carriers they did not know were absent compounded uncertainty. And then the order came: withdraw. The Japanese fleet began to turn. For Taffy 3, the moment was almost unbelievable. The massive, fearsome center force, a fleet meant to annihilate, was pulling away. Ships that should have crushed them had been persuaded, by audacity and improvisation, to retreat. No one on the American side celebrated loudly. There was little time. they still had to protect the carriers and continue launching aircraft. But quietly, a profound relief spread through the crews. This was victory of a peculiar kind. It was not achieved through firepower alone, nor through superior numbers. It was a victory born of courage, calculated risk, and the ability to act decisively under impossible circumstances. The enemy had turned away, not because they were beaten in the conventional sense, but because Taffy 3 had made them hesitate. And in naval warfare, hesitation can be fatal. History would later call it one of the most remarkable defensive actions in the Pacific War. At the moment, it was simply survival. At first glance, the Battle of Samar seemed like a small encounter, a clash between a few escort carriers, destroyers, and an overwhelming Japanese fleet. On the surface, it was a minor part of the Leyte campaign, but in reality, it carried consequences that shaped the Pacific War. By forcing the Japanese center force to withdraw, Taffy 3 prevented a potential disaster for the invasion at Leyte. The transports and landing craft were spared destruction. Thousands of troops, equipment, and supplies reached the beaches safely, ensuring the invasion maintained momentum. Strategically, this meant the liberation of the Philippines remained on track. American forces could continue to consolidate positions, build supply lines, and prepare for further operations in the Pacific. Kurita's failure to press the attack deprived Japan of a last chance to disrupt the American advance. The battle also demonstrated the limits of overwhelming firepower. The Japanese fleet, though numerically and technologically superior, could be checked by audacity, deception, and coordinated defensive tactics. It highlighted that small, well-directed actions could create outsized effects, a lesson that resonated throughout naval command. For the U.S. Navy, Samar became a case study in improvisation under pressure. Commanders learned that initiative at the tactical level could compensate for deficiencies in ship type, armament, or numbers. Courage, timing, and coordination among small units could offset disadvantages against seemingly invincible opponents. Finally, the engagement had a psychological impact. Japanese commanders began to question the assumptions underlying their operations. The myth of invulnerability, reinforced by the size and power of their capital ships, was shattered by 7 small American ships standing their ground. Conversely, American morale soared. The idea that ordinary sailors could influence the course of a major operation inspired both officers and enlisted men across the fleet. In retrospect, the Battle of Samar was more than a defense. It was proof that tactical audacity, disciplined execution, and the willingness to take calculated risks could change the course of a campaign. What seemed like a minor encounter was, in fact, a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, one that ensured the American advance in the Philippines remained unstoppable. And while it was a story of courage, it was also a story of consequences, small actions creating strategic outcomes, bravery shaping history, and 7 tiny ships altering the path of a global conflict. The names of the ships of Taffy 3, Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and the others would eventually be recorded in history. But in the immediate aftermath, their story risked being overshadowed by larger campaigns and bigger fleets. These ships had achieved what should have been impossible. They had delayed, disrupted, and damaged a fleet that dwarfed them in every measurable way. They had saved lives and preserved the invasion force at Leyte, yet their contribution was quiet. Their victories were measured not in ships sunk, but in the moments they brought, the illusions they created, and the courage they displayed. Decorations and awards followed. Posthumous honors were given to those who gave their lives. Captains and crews were recognized for their valor. But for decades, the broader public knew little of the Battle of Samar. It remained a story largely told in Navy reports and oral histories, a remarkable example of bravery buried within the larger narrative of World War II. The legacy of Taffy 3 is more than just names and awards. It is a lesson in leadership and decision-making under impossible circumstances. It is a reminder that even the smallest units, with the right combination of courage, ingenuity, and resolve, can influence events far beyond their apparent capacity. Survivors carried these memories for the rest of their lives. They told stories of ships burning, of torpedoes racing through the water, of planes diving empty-handed against overwhelming odds. They spoke of moments when ordinary sailors made extraordinary choices, decisions that shaped the course of history. And today, the Battle of Samar serves as a symbol. It is a testament to the human spirit, to the power of initiative, and to the unpredictable ways in which small actions can ripple through history. 7 tiny ships, facing overwhelming force, became an enduring example of courage under fire, a story that reminds us that history is often written not only by the large and powerful, but by the daring and determined. As the smoke cleared over the waters east of Samar, the aftermath of the battle was apparent. Ships were damaged, lives had been lost. The Japanese fleet had turned away, and the escort carriers and their small escorts had survived. But the story of what had occurred was more than a tally of ships or casualties. It was a story of human decision-making under impossible circumstances. Courage, audacity, and determination had replaced overwhelming firepower. 7 tiny ships had stood against the strongest fleet Japan could muster, and had altered the course of history through their actions alone. History often remembers the largest battles, the biggest guns, and the most dramatic victories. Yet at Samar, it was not sheer strength that won the day. It was initiative. It was the willingness of officers and sailors to act decisively when faced with a situation that seemed hopeless. It was the belief that even the smallest action could make a difference. The Battle of Samar is a reminder that war is not only about material advantage, it is about people. It is about choices made under pressure, with imperfect information and unimaginable risk. It is about courage and leadership in the moments when survival is not guaranteed. For those who served on the tiny ships, the battle was a test of everything they had learned, every skill and instinct honed over years at sea. Their actions created ripples far beyond what anyone could have imagined. And those ripples shaped not only the immediate outcome at Leyte, but the larger trajectory of the Pacific War. As we reflect on this story, we see a lesson that transcends the specifics of naval warfare. It is a lesson in courage, resilience, and the impact of bold decisions. In the quiet moments after the guns fell silent, the significance of what had occurred became clear. In the face of overwhelming odds, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. And sometimes, the smallest ships leave the largest mark on history. If you love discovering untold stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't regret it.